This session is a continuation of our Black Lives Matter unit, and we are continuing to look at the divisions in the US, today focusing on key figures. Some of the questions that we're going to focus on throughout this session are things such as, what is the North-South divide in America? What was the Civil Rights Movement? Who were the key figures involved in the Civil Rights Movement throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries? And how significant was the Civil Rights Movement in terms of improving the rights of African American citizens in the US? Having a look at this map of the United States, I want you to think for a minute about what the difference is between the red and green states. Some of our more eagle-eyed viewers might notice at the top that it says states with Jim Crow laws, but I want you to think about what does that really mean. Well, what it means is that in those states, on this map highlighted in yellow, it means that those states are segregated by law, which means that there was a legal requirement for black and white citizens to be separated, and that separation occurred in a number of places, including cinemas, restaurants, water fountains, schools. It happened in a lot of different places, and anybody studying history at IB should be able to list lots and lots of those places that we've studied previously. What was the Civil Rights Movement then? So a lot of people might be able to explain the events of it, but actually what was it? What is the definition? Well, it's a struggle for social justice that took place mainly during the 50s and 60s for blacks to gain equal rights under the law in the United States, because previously this had not happened. Some of the most important pieces of legislation that formed part of this movement include things such as the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka judgment in 1954. This said that the doctrine of separate but equal is no longer legally viable. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 overruled discrimination in places such as the workplace. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eradicated literacy tests for black citizens, and then the Loving versus Virginia decision of 1967 legalised interracial marriage for the first time in the US. So you can see that the Civil Rights Movement actually did have a significant impact. Looking at these two images, what we can see is on the left-hand side a protest and school segregation, in this instance sponsored by the NAACP, the National Association of the Advancement of Coloured People, and you can see a more modern classroom in the US on the right-hand side of this slide, where you can see that segregation doesn't happen anymore, the schools are now mixed, and you will see people of all ethnicities in schools. Waiting rooms used to be legally ordered by the police department to be segregated, so there was legal segregation. So previously we had an enforcement by law officers to separate people. However, in the modern US police force, you are likely to see African American police officers. So this again is a significant improvement as a result of the Civil Rights Movement. By colour, and there was on this image on the left hand side of my slide, you can see a barrier which will separate the two halves of the cinema, but now it is common for us to see black citizens on our movie screens, in this instance in Star Wars. And so, the Civil Rights Movement was significant, and we have come quite a long way, especially in the US and the UK. There's been quite a lot of changes. And possibly a more controversial set of two images is that slavery was previously legal, and not just legal, but was enacted by people in the US government. There were incredibly powerful people in the government and in the economy that owned slaves. They were slaveholders, whereas into the 21st century we've seen the first black US president. The question that you have to ask is, how significant was the Civil Rights Movement? And if we look at the laws that were put into place during that period, and then a comparison of sources from the 21st century compared to what we've seen in the past, the civil rights movement was an incredibly significant movement in terms of causing change throughout that century. And it's incredibly important to realise that the civil rights movement is not something that would have happened without certain individuals. And in this session we're going to focus on 6 individuals in particular, both male and female, from the 19th and 20th century that were a causing factor in change. The first one that we're going to have a look at is possibly one of the most well-known case studies, so Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist who refused to surrender her seat to a white passenger on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Previously, in the segregated buses, black passengers would have to sit at the back of the bus, and there were certain rows they were allowed to sit on, and if a white passenger wanted their seat, they were supposed to stand up and move. Her defiance by refusing to give up her seat sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which started in December 1955. It was incredibly successful and lasted for a full year. Its success launched nationwide efforts to end racial segregation of public facilities. So this happens in 1955, which is right at the height of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks and also the whole of the bus boycott is an example of peaceful protest because it's not inciting violence, it's simply a refusal to use the segregated bus services, and this placed economic pressure on the bus companies. Our next example, however, is less peaceful. Malcolm X was an African American civil rights leader who was prominent in the Nation of Islam, which is a civil rights movement, a party. Due largely to his efforts, the Nation of Islam grew from a mere 400 members at the time when he was released from prison in 1952, and then by 1960 had 40,000 members, and so this is an incredible increase in support for that party. He was a naturally gifted orator. He exhorted blacks to cast off the shackles of racism and said that they should do that by any means necessary, which is inciting violence, so less peaceful as a key figure. He was assassinated in 1965, but until then he vigorously supported black nationalism, which is a much more extreme form of fight for civil rights. The next person we will look at is Harriet Tubman, who is a key figure from a little bit earlier on. She was born into slavery in Maryland and escaped to freedom in the North in 1849, so quite significantly prior to the ones that we've been looking at. She became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She risked her life to lead hundreds of family members and other slaves from the plantation system to freedom on this elaborate secret network of safe houses. She led hundreds of enslaved people to freedom along the route of the Underground Railroad and therefore is a significant figure in the fight for rights. It's important to remember that the civil rights movement is not something that happens exclusively in the 60s. It is a hundreds of year old movement that arguably stems in that fight for abolition of slavery. And so these figures are incredibly as important as maybe the more well-known ones, perhaps Rosa Parks being one. Another case study that you could look at is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a scholar and activist who became the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University, and this was in 1895. He wrote extensively and was the best known spokesperson for African American rights during the first half of the 20th century. His works are so significant that they're still studied by universities today. He co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, also known as the NAACP, and that was in 1909. The NAACP becomes a very significant movement during the 50s and 60s at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. Sojourner Truth was an African American abolitionist, meaning that she fought against slavery. She was also a women's rights activist, and she's best known for her speech on racial inequalities called Ain't I a Woman? It was delivered extemporaneously in 1851 at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention. She was born into slavery but escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826. She devoted her life to the abolitionist cause and helped to recruit black troops for the Union Army. The Union Army refers to the Civil War in the US, and the Union was the side that was fighting against slavery. Perhaps one of the most well-known civil rights activists is Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Baptist minister and civil rights activist who had a seismic impact on race relations in the United States beginning in the mid-1950s. Among his many efforts, he headed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is a group known as the SCLC. Through his activism and inspirational speeches, he played a pivotal role in ending the legal segregation of African American citizens in the United States, working with presidents such as John F. Kennedy and also Lyndon Johnson, as well as the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and also had several other honours. So the task for you today is to choose either one of the individuals that I've discussed that we've looked at together, or to choose one of your choice, and I want you to create a well-researched infographic about one of the key figures. It might be useful to you to try and consider key figures outside of what you would usually learn in school. Perhaps you might want to avoid looking at Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King Jr. because they are incredibly well known, and the whole point of our studies of the Black Lives Matter movement is to raise awareness of the extensive history of race studies in the United States. And Canva is a good resource to do that. Okay, just to finish off then, I want us to think about how significant the civil rights movement really was, because throughout this I've talked about the numerous legal changes in the United States and the work done by the people to put those in place. However, let's look at this graph from 2010. So it shows the United States incarceration rates by race and ethnicity. Incarceration refers to people in prison. We can see that per 100,000 people, there are 380 white people incarcerated, 966 Latino people incarcerated, and 2,207 black people incarcerated. For those of you that study IB history, you might want to think about looking at the Loic Wacquant reading that we did that states that subjugation in the United States hasn't actually ended. Slavery never ended, it's just changed form, and now we're in this new era of incarceration. And so yes, the civil rights movement is significant because there have been a number of changes. However, we can argue that it hasn't gone far enough, and it's important that we learn about these issues so that we can continue to enact change in the future.